off we go then. So if imagine you're faced with this, right? So your task as a learner of a new language is to make sense of something of this sort. So this is to kind of make you feel like a baby who is coming to this world and has to figure out, among other things, the grammar of their native language. Of course, they also have to figure out the phonology, the words, and other things. Today, I'm going to focus on word order, as Barbara said. So this is a Hungarian version of Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince. And so one thing you can do, once you spend a little bit of time thinking about things, even if you don't know the words, one thing you can do is to look at how often certain words appear. And so once you start looking at the text, you will, or hear it if you're a baby, you will figure out that a few words like "o," which is the definite article in Hungarian, appear very frequently. So this is already, even without really you knowing what this word is, this is a cue. And then if you spend more time, you will understand that there are many of these words, quite a few of these words that come back repeatedly, whereas others are much less frequent. And this is not only true in Hungarian, obviously, but now if I put here the French original, then you will see that the same regularity applies in French as well. And of course, this is a universal distinction. So since we are among linguists here, this doesn't really need much of an introduction or argument. In the words languages, universally, there is a distinction between two basic lexical categories, functors on the one hand and content words on the other hand. So functors, the key sort of property or function of functors is to signal grammatical relations, and the function of content words is to carry lexical meaning. So in a certain sense, you can think of this as some sort of geomac puzzle or construction, where functors would be the little metallic balls that kind of keep the structure together, and the colorful bars are the content words that bring substance to the whole thing. So if you're a baby learning languages, especially that you're breaking into language, so it means you don't yet have a first language, right? So it's not like an adult learning a second language, but rather really building a first language, then to learn grammar, what you want to do is kind of understand how the little magnetic balls or metallic balls and the rods go together, how to assemble them. So this looks like a really difficult task because structure is not visible really on the surface, right, in the input. But functors and content words are different, not only in their functions, but there are actually low-level perceptually available cues that distinguish the two categories. So functors at the level of tokens, individual tokens, are in general of high frequency, whereas content words are low in token frequency. Functors are typically phonologically minimal. However, it is defined in any specific language. So there's a variety of features that can be minimal, and these change or vary across languages, but some of these include being shorter, typically monosyllabic, having simpler syllable structure, reduced vowels, not carrying stress, and so on and so forth, whereas content words are phonologically heavy. And finally, functors constitute closed classes, which means that you cannot just invent a new functor very easily. That requires historical change, whereas content words come up anew every day, like COVID or iPhone or many others. And so essentially what I'm trying to argue about today in this talk is that one strategy babies could use to learn about grammar is to bootstrap the two categories, content words and function words, on the basis of their surface differences, and use that to go on to the more abstract properties. So this is a general idea in language development known as bootstrapping theory, namely that there are correlations in language between surface properties available perceptually to the learner and more abstract syntactic, grammatical, morphosyntactic, whatever properties. And these correlations might be exploited by the learner So you have the surface cues available in the input, and then you learn about the abstract cues on the basis of the perceptually available ones. Importantly, these are probabilistic or statistical or heuristic cues. So it is, of course, not always the case that every functor is entirely phonologically minimal or every content word is infrequent. Obviously, this is not the case, but on average, these properties hold. And so specifically, what I'm hoping to show you today is that relying on two specific cues, namely token frequency and phonology, so in particular phrasal prosody, babies show sensitivity to the difference between functors and content words, and they show sensitivity to how differently they function, so that functors actually serve to indicate structure, and they also know the relative order of the two categories very early, and they are also aware of, unconsciously, of the open closed class distinction between them. So essentially that very early on, babies know a lot about content words and functors, and they use these two surface cues to identify them. Right, so let's get started then with the sort of the empirical business, so to say. What is it exactly, or how is it exactly that we went about learning about or testing this? So essentially what I have in mind in a very simplistic way, and so I apologize, I know I'm talking to sophisticated linguists, so a lot of what I say is simplification. So of course, if you work on word order phenomena, then a lot of what I say will not be detailed enough. So for any single language or any single phenomenon, these things might not always hold, but as I said, this is about acquisition. So what we need is big generalizations that are good enough to get started. So sometimes the baby will go wrong, but we know empirically that this is the case, right? Babies don't get everything right from the beginning immediately. So these are, really think about this as statistical or probabilistic tendencies, strategies, if you wish, that are good enough as approximations, although for any specific phenomenon or any specific language, they might not cover the whole issue or whole situation. So with this caveat, typologically, we distinguish functor initial and functor final languages. So Japanese, Turkish, or Basque are well-known examples of functor final languages. And so as you see in this very simple illustration, what this means is that, say, in an adpositional phrase, Japanese is going to have a postposition. So you have a content word followed by a functor. The opposite is true in Italian, English, French, many of the Indo-European languages, in which, so this is an example from Italian, what you can see is that the functor precedes the content word. Now, importantly, from the perspective of the learner, the young baby, this very fact, where the functors are positioned, is correlated with a large number of other word order phenomena. So languages that are functor final typically are object-verb languages. They have specific noun adjective orders. They have specific positions for the embedded clause, the subordinate clause, as opposed to the main verb, and so on and so forth, right? So once you figure out this basic property, actually many other things follow. So if you get, this is some sort of indeed a bootstrap or a key to unlock a much more general feature of your native grammar. And obviously, if you think about it, the moment you need to parse more than a single word, or the moment you want to produce more than a single word, order is something you need to deal with, right? Language is linear, so you cannot pronounce two words at the same time. You have to decide which one you're going to say first. So this is a very basic general property if you're a language learner, and of course, if you're a sophisticated speaker as well. And so the first thing we are going to focus on is frequency. So essentially, the questions I'm asking is, can infants distinguish between the two broad lexical categories on the basis of their different frequencies, prosodies or phonologies, and the open closed class distinction? Do they use this to then beyond just discriminating or distinguishing between the two categories, do they also encode their relative position in these very broad terms, as I was telling you? And sort of in terms of the theories of language acquisition, we have a further question, namely the age at which this happens. And the reason for this is that there are two broad theories of the acquisition of grammar, or word order in particular, out there. A family of theories might be termed item-based or usage-based. This theory holds that infants at the beginning do not have a general or abstract representation of word order, but rather for each item, typically verbs, they will learn how they pattern. So essentially, a baby learning English would learn that when he or she learns the verb eat, we'll also learn that cake comes afterwards. So eat cake, eat bread, eat an apple, and so on and so forth. But this knowledge does not generalize onto another verb, see or read, for example. The other family of theories obviously says the opposite, that there is some kind of basic but already abstract representation of word order independently of lexical items from the beginning. And so if we find that babies already have some knowledge about the basic word order earlier than they start to have a lexicon, then of course that is argument in favor of the abstract representational theory. If by contrast we find that really the knowledge of word order emerges only at an age when they start to have a lexicon, then that sort of would support the other alternative. So this is why age will also be a crucial factor here. Okay, so let's start with frequency. That was the first cue, and this is the one that I kind of illustrated already at the beginning. So we are coming back to our postposition preposition example. I don't have slides for this, but we have looked at corpora of child-directed speech in a large number of different languages, and it is the case that, given Zipf's law, it is the case that some functors are very frequent. Actually, the 10, 20, 30 most frequent words in all of the languages we looked at were functors. And broadly speaking, what babies have to take into account or sort of keep track of is exactly this: a couple of frequent words and their position. So if you have entire utterances, empirically in corpora of the languages we looked at, it has always been the case that if you track a few frequent words, then in the majority of the utterances in which they occur, then only looking at the beginnings and ends of utterances, so positions that are perceptually extremely easy for babies to locate, then in functor final languages, these frequent words will occur at the ends of utterances. In functor initial languages, frequent words will occur at the beginnings of utterances in a large number of the utterances. So statistically, in a statistically important large number of the utterances. So now the question only is, since the information is there in the input, the question is whether babies are sensitive to it. So do babies track frequent words and assign them to a position? How did we go about testing this? I'm not sure how familiar you are with infant methodology, so I'm going to take you through or walk you through a typical paradigm, an artificial grammar learning study. So in this artificial grammar learning study, we created this artificial grammar, which is an alternation of two types of categories, frequent and infrequent categories. So obviously we manipulated frequency. As I said, the A and B categories are such that they have a single token. So every occurrence of category A is mapped onto the syllable ge. As you can see here, every occurrence of the category B is mapped onto the single syllable fi. So you can see that ge and fi are extremely frequent. At the level of categories, X's and Y's are equally frequent, but at the level of tokens, they are not, because they are categories that have 9 tokens in them. So anytime you see an X, it will be one of the 9 possible syllables that belong to this category. So for example, here it's mapped onto fo, but here it's de, here it's pa. So essentially at the token level, the realization level, the syllables, the frequent syllables ge and fi are 9 times more frequent than any of the infrequent syllables. And so we synthesized this to be a continuous stream, and we played it to babies for about 4 minutes as the familiarization. Very importantly, the beginning, the first 15 seconds, and the end, the last 15 seconds, were rammed in amplitude, which means that we gave no information to babies about the first syllable and the last syllable. So they could not know what was the phase of it, how it ended or how it began. Let me show you what babies listen to. Roughly. So it's very artificial, it's very boring, but babies happily listen to this for about 4 minutes. And then comes the test phase. So the trick here is this grammar is actually ambiguous in its parse. You could attribute to it a frequent initial parse or a frequent final parse, right? You could say the basic unit is AXBY, so starting with ge, let's say, and you chunk it such that every time you encounter a ge, that is going to be the beginning of your unit. You could do the opposite. You could say, no, the basic unit is XBYA, XBYA. So it starts with an infrequent and ends in a frequent syllable. And so you chunk it that way. There is nothing in the stream, because we rammed the beginning and end in amplitude, there's nothing in the stream that gives you cues about this. So if infants show preference between the 2 possible parses, and this is what we gave them in the test phase. So now these are not long pieces, but rather just small chunks taken from the stream. So they're all familiar, but these small chunks that either begin with a frequent item or end in a frequent item, always respecting, of course, the alternation of frequent, infrequent patterns. And so essentially, and we had 4 of each type, and what we were asking is whether babies have a preference. There is nothing, as that is very important, in the material they listen to, nothing will push them one way or another. It's completely ambiguous. What we were interested in is whether they bring to the task from their native language knowledge a preference one way or another. And crucially, of course, we tested babies with different native languages in terms of word order. And so you could guess already from the examples I gave you, we tested a group of Japanese babies and a group of Italian babies. So Japanese is functor final, so frequent elements are at the end. Italian is functor initial, frequent items are at the beginning. And they were 8-month-old, so crucially pre-lexical. They don't really have a serious vocabulary at this point. So this is the question, right? So without there being any cue in the grammar itself, would Japanese and Italian babies parse this stream spontaneously in opposite ways? If they have abstract knowledge about the word order of their native language, then they might. And so how do we test babies? We test babies using a looking time procedure. So essentially, the test items come from one side or the other of the testing booth. So this is the testing booth, as you can see, baby sitting on a caregiver's lap, and there are lights mounted on the walls of the cubicle. A test item will be presented from either the left or the right randomly. And there is a light blinking on that side. So if the loudspeakers on this side present the test item, then this light will blink. And so this will the baby will look at the light, and we measure the time the baby spends looking at the light, and we use this as an index of the baby's interest in the stimuli or attention to the stimuli. And so we measure the looking times for each of the test items and then average them. Okay, and so this is what it looks like in real time, or that is in real life. This is an actual Japanese participant, and this is to convince you of the fact that looking times are somewhat reliable measures. You will see the baby turning to this side as he is interested in this test item, and then looking, and then very quickly looking away when it's the other test item. In the meantime, I'll show you this, and I will check the question in the QA. Okay, so I will answer the question maybe later. So you see the baby is still looking, interested, very much interested. You can see kind of the blinking of the light reflecting on the face of the baby. Now comes this stimulus, not at all. So this is to say, looking times might not sound extremely precise as measures, but in reality, babies are not too bad at expressing their preference or attention through their looks. And this is what we found. So the figure is organized in the following way. On the y-axis, you have looking time in seconds, as I said, averaged across test items of a given type. This is the looking time measures of the Japanese babies. These are the Italian babies. And so the color codes are the two different conditions, frequent final or frequent initial. So as you can see, Japanese babies show a preference. They look longer to the frequent final items, the ones that resemble Japanese, whereas Italian babies look longer to the frequent initial items, those that sound more like Italian. And this is true even though they are tested on exactly the same material and there's nothing in the material that would make them go one way or another, right? It is the knowledge that they bring to the task that makes them have opposite preferences for exactly the same material. So this is the first indication that they can rely on frequency to identify functors. So crucial elements, anchors in the structure, and then they show already a preference for the order of these frequent items with respect to the infrequent ones that are typical of their native language at 8 months. Okay, so the next thing we thought is, this is great, but what happens if you're a Japanese-Italian bilingual baby? So that is, in other words, what happens if in your input you find structures that are frequent initial and others that are frequent final? So this is when prosody comes to the rescue. It happens to be the case that the realization of contrast or prominence in the prosodic phrases of these two typologically different languages, not just Japanese and Italian, but more broadly frequent initial and frequent final languages, happen to be very different. And this has been shown and measured in work on phrasal or prosodic phonology by Nespor, Selkirk, and others. So crucially, in a language like, in both Japanese and Italian, so both functor initial and functor final languages, the prominent element is always the content word, right? We just said functors are prosodically, phonologically light or reduced or minimal, and it's content words that are heavy. So the prominent element is always the content word. But the prominence, of course, is, because of this, initial in frequent final languages and final in frequent initial languages. Most importantly, it is realized using different acoustic cues. So in functor final languages like Japanese, the contrast, the biggest contrast, is carried by pitch, intensity and pitch to some extent. Whereas in frequent initial languages, the contrast is typically carried by duration, lengthening of the prominent element. So the acoustic cue itself, whether you're hearing a pitch contrast or you're hearing a durational contrast, will give you a cue to the type of language you're in. Again, this has been measured by Marina Nespor, and then follow-up work in our own studies, looking at the languages of the babies that we tested. So at least in those languages we looked at, this was empirically true on average. Now, again, the question is, it is there in the input. Are babies sensitive to this? And so what we did was the following. We went back to our little artificial grammar, but instead of now leaving the structure ambiguous, we actually biased it to the frequent final or the frequent initial parse using prosody. So as we said, pitch contrast means functor final, Japanese. Durational contrast means functor initial, Italian. And so for one group of babies, they listen to the stream with a pitch contrast. Another group of babies listen to the stream with durational contrast. So the underlying structure is still this simple alternation of frequent and infrequent items, but now there is a cue that should push babies one way or another if they are sensitive to the prosody. So again, let me make you listen to this. So you could kind of hear the modulation of the pitch. The duration is less strong. But this is what babies listen to for 4 minutes. And again, we test them on the same items as before, either frequent initial or frequent final. The test items themselves do not have prosody, very importantly. And the crucial point here is now prosody should push you one way or another. So if you heard this frequent final, you should go for these items. If you heard this, you should go for those frequent initial items. And so we tested indeed groups of bilinguals, so frequent initial, frequent final bilinguals, as if they were Japanese Italian. In reality, this was done in Vancouver, so the frequent initial language was always English. The frequent final was any one of those that are spoken in the greater Vancouver area. And we also tested monolinguals, but we should not be concerned with that here. I'm not going to talk about it today. So crucially, can bilinguals use their prosody to select the word order context in which they are at? So to select the language with its grammar. And so here are the results. Again, looking times and the color code as before. So indeed, when we expose them to Japanese-like pitch contrast prosody, they looked longer at the frequent final items. And when we expose them to the durational contrast, so frequent initial type of prosody, then actually they look longer at the frequent initial sequences. So it looks like they were able to indeed use prosody to select between the two word orders. So combining the frequency cue with the prosodic cue. Okay, so far we have seen two of the properties, frequency and prosody, to which babies at 8 months are sensitive. So finally, we said, okay, so can we really try and bring as much evidence as possible to the fact that these are categories that really resemble functors and content words? And the one property that I haven't talked about so far, the open closed class distinction, is the one that we tested as sort of the last kind of piece of evidence we can bring to the question. So we used again our artificial grammar in one study, just as before in the beginning, no prosody, like in the Japanese Italian study at the beginning. But since we tested now the babies in France, we had to have this baseline group that hears no prosody, no manipulation, just the frequency information, to establish that French babies, just like Italian babies, really show a frequent initial parse. Then came the crucial manipulation. After a familiarization that looked like the previous one, now in the test, we substituted either the frequent or the infrequent categories. So, of course, remember, content words come in open classes, so you can easily insert a new word anytime. And so this is what we did in the test. We replaced the infrequent words with new infrequent words. So these red ones are syllables that they did not hear before in the familiarization. But crucially, of course, the frequent words are still the same, so the basic structure is still there. And so now we tested whether French infants maintain their frequent initial preference. And of course, we did the symmetric opposite. So for a third group of babies, now we replaced the frequent words with novel ones. Remember, this is not good, right? In the sense that this is not well formed. In natural language, you cannot just introduce a new functor. And so if babies really consider frequent items functors, then they should not like this. Then they might suppress their preference because they should not accept new functors easily. Keep in mind that logically, it is still possible to derive word order, right? So the infrequent words are still here, and you can still see that this is, if it's infrequent final, then it means it's frequent initial. So logically, you could still show a preference. It's just if substitution is not good, if frequent words also are assumed to be closed class, then this is when the preference should fail. And so here are the results. We tested the 3 different groups. As I said, in the original no substitution study, we replicated the results before. French babies, like Italian ones, show a strong preference for frequent initial sequences. This preference remains when infrequent content words are replaced, as we expect. So indeed, babies are happy with that. They accept new words. So suggesting that they consider infrequent words to come in open classes. Then, however, we replace the frequent words, they lose their preference. They don't show any preference whatsoever, suggesting that indeed they don't like the substitution of frequent words. They expect them to come in closed classes. No new frequent words should be introduced. And they do not use the existing known familiar infrequent words that remain to compute word order. Infrequent words are not to compute structure over. So essentially, with this, we complete, let's say, the picture. So I have shown you that by 8 months of age, so prelexically, infants are sensitive to the frequency difference between functors and content words, the prosodic difference between functors and content words. They're also sensitive to the closed class and open class distinction. And so on the basis of these surface cues, we have also seen that indeed they use functors to compute word order over, but they don't use content words to do that. So they arrive at the actual functional difference between the two. And I myself did not show you and don't have evidence that they use content words to attach meaning to, but this was actually tested even if at 17 months, but this was shown. So indeed, they expect frequent words to be good labels for objects, but they don't like frequent words to be labels for objects. And so I'm going to take another 2-3 minutes just to show you very briefly some comparative data. So the idea of bootstrapping is that this is a good enough strategy for you to start learning. But what happens when you're a sophisticated speaker, an adult? So what happens if ontogenetically with bootstrapping? And the other question is, of course, where does this come from? What happens phylogenetically? So frequency and prosody being surface cues, it could be the case that animals are also sensitive to these cues. So how does this work in human adults and non-human animals? So we tested human adults in a very similar paradigm. They listened to, the grammar was a bit more complicated and a bit longer, but essentially it was the same alternating structure. And then in the test, we tested them on a 2 alternative first choice paradigm. So they heard pairs of test items. Of course, in each pair, one item was frequent initial, the other was frequent final. And we registered, they had 36 pairs altogether. We counted the number of frequent finals, so Japanese-like responses. And we tested Basque and Japanese adults, monolinguals, obviously, in the frequent final language typology or category, and Italian and French adults in the other category. So as you can see, Basque and Japanese adults are well behaved. They had the frequent final preference we expected. Now we were kind of surprised by the Italian and French adults who do not really, numerically, they are below 18. So they show somewhat of a preference in the direction of frequent initial items, but it's not significant. Our hypothesis is that adults actually follow more closely the statistical distributions in the native language. So if you think about it, Japanese and Basque are functor final both in syntax, they are OV languages, but also in morphology. So they are heavily suffixing languages. But this is not true for French and Italian, which are VO languages. So in syntax, they are, if you wish, functor initial, they would have prepositions, let's say, but in their morphology, there's quite a bit of suffixing. So we didn't have a language that is VO and only prefixing. This is a language that there are languages in Africa that are like this. So I'm always looking for collaborators who are willing to test African languages for me to actually prove this completely right. But roughly the idea is that while babies take a sort of the most basic generalization, adults actually follow more closely the input, the statistics of the input, as was also suggested by Alyssa Newport long back for language acquisition. And so now the final point, and then I'll stop, is we tried to test rats as well. In one experiment, they were tested on very similar test items, so frequent initial and frequent final. And they don't have language, right? But they are sensitive to frequency. And what we found was that they showed a preference for frequent initial items. That sounded like, well, maybe there is something basic about being frequent initial, something default-like, if you wish. Some of you might even think of Richard Kane's obligatory VO, word order, and things like that. But then we did something. We tested them in a second experiment on items that didn't have this alternating structure. So they had syllables that were either only frequent or syllables that were only infrequent. And they still went for the frequent initial sequence. So the sequence that only had frequent words in it. In other words, what they like is frequency at the beginning, but they don't care whether there is structure underlyingly. So essentially, having the same perceptual sensitivity, the ability to pick up frequency, doesn't then map onto linguistic representation in non-human animals, at least in rats, whereas it does in babies. And so with this, I wrap up. I have tried to show you that, that there is a mechanism, perceptual bootstrapping, that allows infants on the basis of frequency and prosody to break into word order, this very basic property of their native language. Thank you very much for your attention.